Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Property and Investor Podcast. This is the podcast where I speak to some of the most interesting and inspiring and resilient people, property investing and beyond. Of course, I am your host, Paul Lanfear. Now, the inner lawyer needs to say something, so let's get that out of the way. Nothing in the podcast, financial advice, legal advice, health advice. Of course, do your own due diligence. It is with genuine delight that I introduce our guest, Dillon Dhanecha, today. Dillon, who I've known for years and years and years, and I think you're going to find fascinating, is tech entrepreneur, endurance swimmer, property investor. He describes himself in some circles as a seeker, servant, speaker. Probably the most recent context I've heard Dillon speak is where we may go later, which is how we're being neurologically hacked around money and psychologically enslaved around the economy. But before we get to that, we've probably got plenty of other things to discuss. Dillon, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, my brother. Very grateful to be here, man. Very grateful.
Absolute pleasure to see you. Now, I've known you for years and years and years. I've seen you speak at a whole cross-section of events, but my audience, not all of my audience, may have had that benefit. So I'd like you to kind of give us the origin story, and feel free to start actually at the beginning, where were you born, who your parents are. So really give us the true context of who Dillon is and how you've emerged into this world, and then bring us up to the current day.
That's actually a really beautiful place to start, not because of my origin story, but really because of the origin story of my parents. And interestingly enough, I just kind of took on a biographer to write my dad's story. It's something my dad's been wanting to do for years. So my parents came to this country as refugees in the early 70s from East Africa. Their parents and my grandparents had been taken to East Africa by the British Empire to service the building of the East African Railroad. So there's a huge community of East African Asians got deported from Uganda. Well, my parents were kind of part of that expulsion in 1972. So that played actually really kind of heavily into the mindset around success, around money, around performance, around duty, that I kind of was brought up under. And with that came a lot of pressure around, particularly for me, who was naturally somewhat of a renegade, rather that actually sounds too well thought out, somewhat of a loose cannon is probably the right description. Renegade sounds quite good. Loose cannon describes actually what I was and perhaps what I still am. And so there was an environment there, Paul, of criticism, of comparison, of complaint, of not fitting in, of not conforming. And, that I know came from the fear that my mother had, particularly, that we would not, we'd not become the human beings that perhaps we had the potential to become. And so whilst we had a really loving, compassionate, beautiful upbringing, I never felt like I wanted for anything. Although looking back, I remember Dad bringing home, one portion of chips after doing overtime on a Saturday, and we'd share that. I remember him bringing back his half-eaten kind of packed lunch. There'd be half a sandwich and the remainder of a penguin or whatever it was in the 1980s, and we'd take that down to the river and have a picnic. I'm not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that we were on the bread line necessarily, but psychologically we were on the bread line. Psychologically, there was never enough money to have pocket money and so on and so forth. So real bizarre set of circumstances, really. My father is an accountant, yet is the kind of human being that you are inspired by through his actions, not through his advice. And I always kind of think about that quote, the man with the loudest brain has the quietest voice. Well, that's my father, quite the opposite of me. I think I'm the opposite, but that's my father. So kind of under that background, under that upbringing, as soon as I got my freedom, in those days, I considered it to be financial freedom, i.e. I was now in control of just how much money I could put on a credit card. I was in control of just how much debt I could take on. Well, that just led to kind of, between the ages of 17 and I'd say my early 30s, that just led to a period of complete financial chaos, absolutely utter financial chaos, but also what I might call kind of career chaos, life chaos, identity chaos. Like I didn't know who I was until I went to university and started finding out who I was. And I actually became a person that possibly, I don't look back on with any sense of judgment, but certainly a person that I was not brought up to be in many situations, in many circumstances, in many respects. And so it's been, I would consider myself to be very much a late developer in terms of all those things. I heard on some TikTok or YouTube the other day about a guy whose advice from his mother was, experience everything in your 20s and then find your specialism in your 30s and, master your specialism in your 40s and then, retire in your 50s. And I'm thinking, well, I didn't find my specialism until probably sometime in the next decade. I still don't think I found it. So,
okay,
I guess in a sentence, beautiful upbringing, phenomenal parenting. Absolutely love my parents. I feel a real sense of duty to them, whether that's conditioned or whether that's, I don't know where that comes from, but I feel a real sense of duty to them. That said, we're very open and honest about the bits that they might not have got quite right, and the bits that they brought through into their parenting from their parenting. Does that make sense? It's ancestral. And so that brings us here to today, where I feel very blessed to have resolved those money mindset challenges. I feel ridiculously blessed to have a property portfolio that does what I always wanted to do, which was to house refugees. We used to go down to Clifton, literally Bristol. My parents lived on the Westmoreland Army camp for the first few weeks that they were here in the country, and then there was a huge media kind of story around, can you host families? The same as what we've had for the Ukrainian refugees, actually, like almost identical. Can you host a family? I mean, a beautiful couple, Keith and Elizabeth Townend, had a number of fostered and adopted children. They were both doctors in a place called Eastern Ingledano, just outside of Clifton, like salt of the earth human beings. And every time we'd go and see them, Heath would tell me the story about how he picked my father, my mother, and my two-year-old brother up from Westmoreland Army camp, and Dad was still in his short sleeve shirt, where my mother and my brother were kind of wrapped up, and all that stuff. And he'd tell me about how they took my father in. And I actually, at that point, wasn't really that interested in my dad's backstory. It's like sat in awe at this guy who was just like, how can you be so good? This is insane. And that was really where the spirit of service kind of, honestly, it just grabbed me by the fucking balls. And even at that point, but I was tiny in those days, young. And even then, I remember thinking, imagine if I could be like Keith. Imagine if I could take in a family. And so, fast forward to 2023, and we've now got a small but meaningful property portfolio. I just learned that one of the Syrian refugee families that we took in around about 6 or 7 years ago, the girl has now, the daughter, who's the eldest child, she's got 2 younger brothers, the daughter has just finished A-levels and started at Edinburgh University doing a degree in architecture. And I'm like, that's what it's all about. And it just kind of, I had no intentions of growing my portfolio, because I love nice stuff. I like doing nice things, but actually I'm quite comfortable with what we've got. But hearing that, I'm like, right, okay, what more can we do? How many more can we take on? How many Ukrainian families can we house? How many Afghanistani refugees can we bring into our portfolio? And I'm like, what can we do to house more families, to hear more of these stories, to break more cycles of poverty and poverty mindset and refugee mindset, which has taken me decades to do, absolute decades to do, and has sent me down many dead ends and wrong turns.
So I want to, if it's okay with you, I'd like to visit some of those dead ends and wrong turns, right?
Yeah,
because one of the motivations of doing the podcast was, I think, and you're welcome to disagree with me on this, but I think that resilience is like absolutely at the cornerstone of any person you've ever seen made any progress. And I would go as far as to say, you know, it's not what we're bombarded with. Like, you don't need to be the best, you don't need to be the cleverest, you don't need to be the funniest, you don't need to be the strongest, you don't need to have the six-pack or anything like that. This is just my perspective on life. What I've learned, you know, in the last, you know, few decades, is that it's really those people who are just resilient. They can just get back up and kind of digest their failures and challenges or learning points, whatever you want to call them. Obviously, so you've kind of alluded to going down, you know, a few dark paths. We're going to get to the property stuff in a minute, but if we can just kind of go back in time and tell us a little bit about kind of before you are the tech entrepreneur you now are, the financially free, I would say enlightened human being that you are, Dillon. Like where were you before? So let's deal with that chapter of early life, of kind of entering the workplace. Like, what kind of jobs did you do? And what were some of these, you know, wrong turns you felt like you made? And obviously this is not coming from a place of judgment. It's like, we're all here to learn, aren't we? And we're all here to kind of understand ourselves a bit better.
So if I could kind of, I guess if I could put it down to one thing, it would be modeling the wrong kind of, not wrong kind of human being, sounds like I'm doing the judgment, but modeling the kind of human beings who I thought were kind of representative of success. So growing up in a council estate, you know, who were the guys that had the newest cars, the hottest girls, and all the money? You know, what did they do? They sold drugs, essentially. And so they were living on the fringe, at kind of in that way, living on the fringe, you know, rather than living on the fringe of using that renegade spirit to be entrepreneurial, to take risks, to build businesses, to serve other human beings, to, you know, to do some good in the world, to, you know, make more, give more, love more, share more, whatever. That kind of entrepreneurial spirit, or that renegade nature, manifested in ways that I look back on now as, they taught me quite a lot, and they taught me some street smarts, and they taught me like this kind of intuitive ability to find out what's going on in my environment, you know, to read a room, to read an environment, to read a human being, and understand that you're actually a police officer in disguise, you know, things like that. And this is interesting to have this conversation with a lawyer, but essentially it, like, yes, I learned loads from that, and I have reconciled that past. And I was never, you know, I was never the Mr. Nice, the biggest hash dealer on the planet, but they were the human beings that would inspire me at that time. Not the violent criminals, but somebody like Howard Marks, that kind of Welsh, nice guy. In fact, his persona was Mr. Nice. And I remember at university reading that book back to back, like 5 or 6 times. Mm-hmm. And that just gives you, perhaps in a sentence or a paragraph, the kind of influences maybe that led me down some paths that, you know, I would never, ever wish upon anybody. Now, that coupled with a really disastrous money mindset, mm-hmm, can lead you to some real like financial chaos. So that was kind of one aspect. Mm-hmm. The other aspect was this deep insecurity, this deep lacking of self-worth, this deep confusion around who I was and what I was here to do. So I would latch on to, you know, anything that made me feel good, whether that was substances or actually whether that was behavior. So I remember at 6 years old, 1984, I wrote a letter to Santa Claus, you know, as part of you know, your school, you write a letter as part of Christmas. And a massive list of things. Always like nice things, you know. I wanted the rally burner, I wanted the rally banana, which was the BMX and the yellow and blue racer, and I wanted all the things. And I then wrote another letter to Father Christmas after seeing the Band-Aid appeal, the Ethiopian Bob Geldof appeal, which was actually, you know, dear Father Christmas, please don't bring the presents to me. Please send them to the children in Ethiopia. And I don't know where that came from. I was sitting in a living room watching this thing going on, and I remember kind of shouting to my mum, you know, why have they got, there's like no toys? And I didn't kind of saw past the bloated bellies, the flies, the nakedness, the naked mums. So I kind of saw past that. But I just looked at this environment, and there were like no toys at all in this environment. And so that's what triggered the sending of these Christmases. Now that led to like huge, what I would consider to be acceptance and adoration almost. I was featured in the local paper, and then the national campaign manager came down, and you know, there were all these press officers squashed into my mum and dad's tiny little council estate house. And that made me feel like center of attention for the first time in my life. I wasn't being compared to, because even when we were tiny, we were always compared, you know, are we going to the temple? You know, are we sitting at the front? Are we saying our prayers? Do we know the chants? Do we know the mantras? You know, and so at kind of 6 years old, I get this like feeling of what it feels like to be center of attention and to be accepted and to be the shining star in and amongst, you know, lots and lots of cousins. And because my parents had not, when we think about it, they'd only been in the country like 12, 15 years, actually not that long. Still tapped into the broader, wider family network. We would meet most weekends. And so that then led to me anchoring giving to being accepted, to having some level of worth. And so, you know, after the disastrous periods through university, through my 20s, and the kind of the debauchery and a few jobs, I kind of ended up working for an organization that essentially held conferences, tech conferences in Africa. And we, you know, it was quite cool actually. You know, it was, you know, how do we use technology to bridge the gaps between rich and poor? So we met a lot of the presidents, vice presidents, director generals of ministries, and CEOs of Africa's biggest tech companies. And I was running their innovation workshops, their change management workshops, and was co-chairing the event. Serendipitous in its own way, in many ways. But I kind of gave all that up and volunteered for the United Nations. I bumped into a guy who ran a charity. I got really kind of just swept up by the story of Rwanda, and just said to him, right, Frank, you know, how do I come and volunteer for you? What do I do? And he put me through this process, the UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And rather than helping the charities to raise more money, I'd been so accustomed to just being able to get cash whenever I needed it, whether that was earned cash or borrowed cash. I just proceeded to borrow tens of thousands of dollars or pounds, converted then to dollars, and just giving it away. You know, and one of the first times that happened was I was talking to essentially the leaders of a coffee cooperative. They were talking about harvests and needing an irrigation system, and you know, needing $7,000 for an irrigation system to make harvest. And if they didn't get it, then they wouldn't make harvest. And we went through this like long, protracted conversation, which made me feel really stupid at the end. And essentially, it was looked at them like, do we have to spell it out to you? If we do not get the money, we don't get the irrigation system. And if we don't get the irrigation system, we can't actually sow, or because we're not going to make the harvest. And if we don't make the harvest, we'll lose essentially, if you think about the bell curve, we'll lose the youngest and the eldest members of the village. And that's what's been happening for the last few years. And you hear something like that, having come from a financial services trading background anyway, you start looking at the probabilities of them getting the money, getting all of the money, getting the money on time, which are next to nothing. And how quickly can I get $7,000? And then how quickly did that anchor me right back to being a person of worth, being the hero of the day. And that just led to me having a disastrous time during my volunteering period. and getting myself, you know, in over £100,000 worth of debt, hitchhiking back across the Rwanda-Kenya border. I say hitchhiking, I actually got a lift with a truck from the coffee cooperative who I'd given that first amount of money to, like the fucking irony of the whole thing. And they, you know, he dropped me off at the edge of Nairobi, got his uncle to come and pick me up from the middle of nowhere with my bags in a taxi, took me to Nairobi airport because I just had the return leg of my international flight. I didn't have enough money and didn't want to ask anybody for money to get my internal flight ticket from Rwanda to Kenya. So I guess in a broad nutshell, lots of conflicted ideas about who I was, lots of attachment to needing to be accepted, needing to be loved, needing to have some worth, you know, needing to be useful, needing to be, yeah, somebody that actually makes a difference to the world in some way or shape or form, and all the different kind of permutations of that, I guess.
So now you've given me a headache, Dillon, because I obviously want to go immediately down this place with you, because I want to unpack that. Because I think when you're talking about people's feeling of, well, you're talking about it in yourself, but the truth is that it is in all of the population, these feelings of insecurity, lack of self-worth, thinking that, you know, the shiny things will bring happiness and they'll fill that hole almost. But yet, but I do want to get onto the chronology. I do want to segue into like how you become financially free. But let's pause on this.
You're in charge, brother. You're in charge. You take this way.
So look, let's go there. So let's go there. So because this is where the rubber hits the road. You know, there's no point us all learning clever things and doing things out in the world if the inner world is not aligned. You know, because everything in the outer world comes from within, like the signal is all within. So let's go there. Like, you know, so how did you solve this problem, Dillon?
It rooted in my upbringing. I remember coming back from Rwanda. It was November 2011, and I'm back at my parents' house, and I'm there on the living room floor, just in absolute pieces. And I can see this like it was yesterday. You know, my dad is standing at the doorway, my mum is sitting on the sofa, and I'm kind of just sat on the floor. And my mum is my mum's explaining to me the kind of the broader Vedic, Hindu, Indian concept of wealth, and the concept that wealth is actually, you know, it's more than money. And whilst we might revere the Lord Lakshmi, who is the Lord of wealth, actually, if you look at what she represents, money is just one aspect. And so she's talking to me about wealth, and my dad's kind of not saying much as usual, but I can just see in him this sense of complete and utter love and compassion and forgiveness, if that's a word. And I'm at the lowest point in my life, financially, spiritually, emotionally, physically. And yet, is probably the time in my life where I felt the most, I'm a real fucking parent pleaser. Like, it's the time in my life where I felt the most accepted and the most loved by my parents. It absolutely nuts. I cannot explain to you what that felt like to receive. And I've always been loved. My brother and my sister will tell you I've always been, I'm a middle child, but no middle child syndrome at all, ever. And they will tell you that I've always been the favorite and so on and so forth. But I'd always seen in my parents and heard in my parents this sense of, how is he so smart yet so fucking dumb? You know, it's that kind of like, why is he back here again? How is he getting himself into such trouble and calamity and chaos? He's so smart. What's wrong with him? But at that point, there was none of that. There was no judgment. There was nothing. And as my mother was explaining to me about this principle of wealth and the Lord Lakshmi, this weird, bizarre thing happened. I saw my degree photograph, my graduation photo on the wall behind my mum. And out the corner of my eye, I saw the photograph that was featured in the paper of me writing the letter to Santa Claus. And it's beautiful because I had my tiny baby sister sat there with me, and kind of, it was almost like I made this bridge between like what I knew about money and finance and economics and trading and all of these kind of cool things. What I felt in my heart was my duty and my reason for being, you know, whether that was rooted in the conversations that I overheard with Keith, or whether that was giving my presents away, or whether that was trying to be someone of value in Rwanda. And then I saw my mother, who at that point represented spirituality, not religion, not motherhood, not judgment, not comparison, not criticism, not complaint, not self-loathing, not needing to be anybody, but she just represented for me spiritual growth. It's a really weird, I'm explaining it, of course, but I can't make sense of it necessarily. There's my graduation photo, there's my mother in the middle, and then there's this other photo here, and there's this just beautiful lineage, this beautiful line between the three. And that's when I would have done anything at that point, anything. And I guess I've always been a little bit, you know, I've been rooted in spirituality, I've been rooted in the Hindu religion. And so that's always been a default for me. And I just went back into that space. And I actually didn't go back through the scriptures. I think you might have to see the Gita behind me and so on. But I didn't go back to the scriptures. I went to the modern interpretations of spirituality and the more mainstream interpretations of spirituality. And you know, I came across people like the amazing, beautiful human being that was Wayne Dyer. And I just kind of, he just soothed me in so many ways, and was the opening of my heart, the opening of my soul, the opening of my mind. And that then brings me now to a place where, you know, I'm firmly rooted in this place, at this beautiful intersection I'm playing at, which is the intersection of spirituality, neurology, and technology. You know, using neurology to explain what the spiritualists have been talking about for thousands of years, and then deploying technology to shortcut the process to enlightenment, whatever that means. But certainly, you know, I would consider my mother and my father to be the roots of all of the expansion that I've needed in my life to bring me to this place where I now feel I don't have to do anything for anybody. And whilst I will do everything for everybody, and essentially that's what I've committed my life to, I don't have to do that to feel good. I do it because I fucking love it. And it meets my every need in terms of lifestyle, in terms of what I'm able to do, the areas of work that I'm able to engage in, the kind of people I'm able to meet, the human beings I'm able to serve, the impact I'm able to make. But none of that now comes from, of course, there's a bit of ego in there. There wouldn't, because there always is, but it doesn't come from this deep craving to be someone of use. There's like that overzealousness has gone. Just the like, okay.
So like you're almost operating on different fuel, you know. So for example, you know, you will occasionally come across somebody who is you know, like the woman scorned thing of revenge is like the fuel, and they go and do absolutely mind-blowing things. But then the question comes later is like, how long do you want to run that fuel for? Is there a different kind of fuel we could use? And obviously you've tapped into spirituality. And what's fascinating is obviously having seen you speak in all kinds of different contexts, you know, you do have a very, very different voice to the other speakers. You know, even back like, you know, I don't know, was it a decade ago, maybe less than a decade ago, but like attending like, you know, speaking at events where there's multiple speakers and most of them are talking about property, and you were coming from this completely astonishing place of mixing both the property and the spirituality. So how did we get there? So take us from this kind of, I'm going to use the word awakening, I hope that you don't mind that, to the kind of the present day of being this person who is financially free, who has the wider interests and is obviously on you know, their own journey as well. So take us through that section, as briefly or as long as you like, and chuck in the practicalities of it. So how do you come to have a property portfolio? And you don't, from our various interactions, you are not a man whose phone is pinging every 15 seconds with tenants asking him questions. So you've done this in a way which has allowed you to maintain your spiritual freedom, and if I may venture, a sense of peace as well, which is what I always pick up when I get the pleasure of spending time in your company. So take us into that world. How does that transition work?
So during this period, 2011, where I felt I was going to save the world, essentially, because all the way up till November, I actually thought it was working in exactly the way it should be working. It was only in November that I realized just how bad my situation was. But it didn't creep up on me. It was like November, I ran out of money, and now I'm utterly like, what's going on? But there was some magic that happened in 2011 amongst all the other kind of bits and pieces of calamity and chaos. I used to kind of, when I was back here, I would work at a place sticking flipping like lipsticks onto Cosmopolitan magazine and crayons onto Thomas the Tank Engine cartoons, piecework essentially, just to try and bring something in. I was slow and crap, so I wasn't actually bringing much in, but I was doing something. Anyway, I then went to an event. So I would spend time personal developing, trying to figure out, all these other things, like how could I maybe use my trading skills in a more meaningful way? How could I maybe do something to help others? And there was all this stuff going on. And I managed to, I guess, blag attendance at a property meet in Birmingham. It was so weird that it was either I could afford to get myself there in fuel money, or I could pay for the £20, whatever it was, for the ticket for the evening.
Yeah.
In either case, I had to risk getting a parking ticket because I couldn't afford the ridiculously expensive parking at this place in Birmingham. It was the Garden Inn, Holiday Inn, whatever it is. It's in a nice-ish part. And anyway, so I managed to blag entry to the property meet by being able to help them. So essentially, if you come, you set up the table, you put out all the name badges, the kind of stuff, and you help the speakers, you mic them up, and then stay till the end and wrap up. Then you can come and attend. And I only met the lady that ran that property meet in 2010. At a public speaking event that a friend of mine paid for. So I was due to do a TED talk in October, TEDx talk in October, about the work that we'd done in Africa, the commercial work that we'd done in Africa. And so Chris paid for this ticket for me to go to a public speaker training, which actually wasn't a public speaker training at all. It was, I'm not going to say who it was, but it was awful. It was, it opened with, you think you're here to learn how to speak. You're not. You're here to learn how to get people to pay you for your products. And I'm like, God, this is not where anyway, that's a different story. So I met this lady there and we really connected, and I kind of talked to her about the work that I had been doing and what I was on the course for. And we struck up a relationship, and that relationship is what then led me to volunteering for her property meet. So now the ticket was free. I could pay for the fuel. I still had to risk getting a parking ticket. And there was the blessing of never getting a parking ticket. I heard there about two things: HMOs, options. And HMOs were first. And I remember, quite funny. So I remember hearing about HMOs, and I'm the kind of individual that if I hear something that resonates with me or I believe in, whether I should believe in it or not, or whether it should resonate or not, I will act on it straight away. Like that impulsive nature to act on something immediately has never left me, ever. And so I remember driving back from Birmingham. I'm coming back. I'm maybe like 2:30, 3 in the morning by the time I get back. And I popped into the room next door, which was my brother's old room that is now set up as a guest room because my brother lives abroad. And I took photos of this room and put them onto Spare Room and another site at the time, which was called Easy Roommate.
Okay.
You may or may not remember them. And the whole idea was that you could test appetite, test demand in your area by putting up a fake ad and, you know, seeing what bites you get, and do that in all the areas that you might want to invest in. So I kind of did it. Got up the next morning, whatever, in a couple of hours time, went and did the job. It was a 5 a.m. start, got back in the afternoon, like 2 in the afternoon, checked the advert. Oh my God, there's like 18 or 19 responses on both platforms. This is nuts, nuts. Long story short, I ended up renting out my brother's room in my mum and dad's house, and then going and talking to my mum and dad about it. And honestly, I cannot tell you, Paul, every time I talk about them, they're still alive, they're still with me, so there's no reason I should be getting this emotional. But every time I think back to all the things they've done for me, it just blows my mind. And I hope one day that I can be that kind of parent. And they just didn't say a thing. It was like, okay, fantastic. In fact, what my dad did say was, why don't you put letters around the rest of the street? You know, we're all old in this street and we've all got empty rooms and all of our children have left. There's not many like you that have come back. Anyway, which is exactly what I did. So, you know, within a period of like 3 or 4 months, I've got around about 80 to 85 rooms being rented out in the vicinity of where my parents live. And this is at a time when I'd met my now wife, Priya. We'd met first date, January 22nd, 2011. All she'd seen of me was the TED Talk. She thought she was meeting somebody that had his shit together, and she met me and I've got nothing. And we're spending our Friday evenings hand posting letters through doors, you know, asking if they've got rooms to let. Anyway, within a month, 3 or 4 months, we've got 80 to 85 rooms. And my whole business model around that was, whatever you want for the room, we'll advertise it, we'll vet the tenants, we'll do this, we'll do everything, we'll collect the rent for you. My commission is £15 per week per room.
Okay.
So we've got like 80, 85 rooms.
Yeah.
It's nuts. This is now quite a bit of money for somebody that's making like all of about 187 an hour on lipsticks, you know. And then that led to, I then started thinking about, okay, oh, by the way, I've also rented out my room. So that was the second room I rented out was my room. And I remember the guy, Nilesh, an Indian guy that worked for a consulting company, downstairs, whilst my mum and my dad are kind of just holding him downstairs, keeping him busy, while Priya and I are upstairs, moving all my belongings from my room into my sister's room. My sister lives in London, piling it on the bed and setting up a sleeping bag on the side. So I slept in a sleeping bag whilst I had Nilesh and one other girl, I can't remember the girl's name now, it will come to me, in my brother's and my room. So now, you know, one's at £85 a week, the other's at £85 a week. This is fantastic. My mum's only concern was, I've got no kitchen cupboards. Like, what do you expect me to do? Like, I have got no space for Nilesh. And anyway, so I then got a lease option. I invested some money in 2 guys to come and visit me at my mum's house and teach me about lease options. One of them was that, well, they were both Ben and Barry. People might have heard of them, you know, 10, 12, 15 years ago. 2 Bristol lads, ironically. And I paid for them, I think it was like, whatever it was, 1,500 quid or 2 grand, whatever it was, to come and spend the day with me in Peterborough and essentially show me what I could do. And what lease options were and how I might get one. And it just, the universe had my back. I just got one lease option. So I had that when I was out in Africa. And when I came back, that was the strategy that I scaled, essentially. I very quickly had to wind up the 85 rooms. Okay. Well, it got to the point where, and a couple of really weird things happened. So I had one old lady, beautiful, amazing human being, and she's got 3 young lads in her house. And I walked in one Friday to collect the rent, and like, I can smell weed, ridiculously strong. I mean, this is not just a small bag's worth. So I don't know what was going on and how much they had or didn't have or whatever, but it was like, okay, this is now getting a bit worrying already, because I'm like, this is So I can't have this, and neither do I want to be like the dickhead that kind of has a difficult conversation. I'm really bad at difficult conversations. And so I called a couple of insurance companies to try and get insurance for this business. And of course, I'm not a registered landlord. I'm not RLA registered. I'm not a letting agency. Like, I'm nothing that they would need to issue an insurance policy. I've just got like my vetting process is a couple of emails to previous employers and a quick check on Facebook. So no credit reference. And so like I stopped renewing agreements, shall we say.
Okay, look, let's pause for breath.
Yeah, sorry.
This is brilliant. So you get to 85 rooms by hook or by crook. Let's not focus too much on the detail. You get to 85 rooms. So I should have done this while you were speaking, but I didn't. I never like to be rude and kind of look away from my guest. But okay, so wow, so that's pretty good.
I know. Wow.
I've just done the maths. So that's like
drug dealer money, but not being a drug dealer.
That's 5k a month. So that's that's a great living. Let's be completely honest with it.
Okay.
And then I suppose just parking and flagging this up because it's just not to be missed in the story is that what Dillon you're describing there is the ultimate property hack. You know, and if anyone ever asks me like what is the ultimate property hack, it is by some method find a 4-bedroom house. Assuming this is at the right stage of life, let's put it in that way. Try and get a 4-bedroom house somehow, and then with all the right consents and all, you know, like don't do anything that you shouldn't be doing. Rent out, get some lodgers, pay, obviously do a tax return, do all the appropriate stuff. But this is the mode by which my beloved wife Liz Lanfear, you know, that's where she started with this property journey. It was doing that, and then I replicated it completely independently in a later stage of my life. And it is the ultimate property hack. And even if you don't want to do anything else, but if you can kind of live cost-free an early stage in life, and let's say you also have a job, and you're able to allocate some of the money that you earn from your job to just, you know, investing it, you know, we'll talk about asset allocation later, but just putting money away every single month because you've taken care of your daily needs. That is the road to freedom. That is freedom in all kinds of senses, not just the pounds and the pence, but that's spiritual freedom. That's the road to spiritual freedom as well. But so I had a question on that. So, I think we should give the shout out to Barry Davies. That Davies, that's presumably who you were referring to.
Yeah, Ben and Barry, Ben Lanfear, Barry Davies. Yeah.
So we did a bit of work with Barry as well. One of our first ever mentors, and he wrote that book called Escape the Rat Race, and he tells this very funny story about these 2 flats that he did that didn't quite go to plan. So yeah, a shout out to Barry.
Definitely shout out to Ben and Barry. Love those guys. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we did some work in them very, very early doors, and 100% fantastic experience, and no doubt the living rich and fulfilling lives in private. Good. Anyway, so moving on. So we've got these 85 rooms by hook or by crook. Bring us up to the current day. So now you are financially free. You've got this portfolio, but you're not the kind of man whose phone is pinging every 20 minutes. How have you managed it now? So like, where are we now?
So, and the reason I'm not that man is because I was that man.
Okay.
I did everything myself. In fact, that first renovation, Dad and I did, and it was awful. You know, trunking across the ceilings, linking all the smoke detectors, and you know, it was a real. Imagine you're fixing a Ford Escort with a Haynes manual. That's how we did that house, and that's actually how my dad did the car. So, and so I was collecting rents. You know, I was getting the voice messages at 2 a.m. from, you know, irate, really not very nice people that were locked out, that would threaten to put a baseball bat around my head if I didn't come and let them in, and all sorts of just horrible stuff. Now, as it happened, although I'm not a fighter and I don't like difficult conversations, I'd been around those kind of individuals a lot. So I did understand that a lot of it was talk and so on, but it kind of also was like my backside was twitching because it's not really the kind of thing that I wanted to do. And by the way, the reason I was never really kind of that deep, although I was deeply involved in debauchery, I was never involved deeply in criminality, simply because I just never had the balls to kind of risk being arrested and put away. You know, that was the kind of the thing that frightened me most was jail time. And so I stayed away from, and again, I guess that comes down to a deep-rooted desire for freedom and deep-rooted desire to be free. And so I didn't feel free, but I really needed the cash, and couldn't afford to give away any of the cash. And there was, dude, there's been so much serendipity that's happened in my life, which is, I think, why I find myself in this place right now, working on the things I love working on. So towards the end of these first lease options expiring, and the whole strategy was use the rent. So there were 4-bedroom houses, split into 6 bedrooms. So it was a particular floor plan in particular postcode areas, because they were all built in the same way. So I would just find these houses, and when we were walking around the streets, I know that's this floor plan, let's put a letter through there. So we started getting really specific on the kinds of properties that we were requesting appointments with. 4 beds split into 6 bedrooms with a communal living area. You know, they would gross, fully occupied, they would gross around about £1,800 a month. And they would net, depending on what we were paying the landlord and so on and so forth, they'd net anywhere between £500 and £900 per month per property. So, oh my God, this is a gold. Like, property really is a gold mine. This is nuts. Like, everything that they said in that room in the Birmingham property meet was true. This is insane. Along with the headache that comes with you know, certain demographics of HMO tenants, right? Leave it at that. The areas that I grew up in, essentially. Towards the end of this lease option period was when the first kind of the big tranche of Syrian refugees started coming into the city. Now, I had already worked very, very closely with, you know, certain councils and their homelessness departments, trying to do something about homelessness in different cities, in different areas where, you know, where we had our properties. And so it was kind of a natural progression for me to then start speaking to the individuals responsible for housing refugees. And there was a central government mandate, again, similar to what there was when my parents came to the country, a central government mandate that all councils will host a certain number of, you know, incoming refugee families. And so I just put the feelers out, you know, what's happening, how's it working? And because I'd already worked closely with the homelessness teams, and they could see, I think, that there was some genuine desire there to help these incoming individuals and these incoming families. And so it just worked out really weirdly. As the HMOs, as the lease options started to come to the point at which they needed to be executed on, I was lining up refugee families. At that time, they were Syrian refugees, with councils to take on then a 60-month commercial tenancy, and they would manage the property. Essentially, that is as hands-free as property investment can get, I feel. So I would execute on the lease option and then give it immediately to the councils or the housing associations or the charities responsible for housing these refugees. And they would take them on 60-month leases or 60-month tenancies, fully maintained. And it was just, okay. So now we have this HMO lease option strategy where we were taking specifically these 4-bedroom specific floor plan properties, executing on the options at 6 years. And in those days, they were all 72-month lease options, all with the kind of execution fee that I thought was reasonable. So what I didn't do, I just projected how much these properties I thought they would be worth. And so I added up the rent plus what I'm going to pay for the property and showed them that, look, here's the thing, that property is going to be worth maybe 130, 140, 150, 180, I think, in 6 years. Let's make the total you get out of that number. So that will include rent and the execution. And so everyone was happy. I never had anybody got annoyed. You know, everybody was glad for me to execute on the options, which is something I was really careful about at the beginning. I didn't want any bad feelings. I didn't want to agree an option fee of like 80 grand on a property that then was going to be 150, 160. That I didn't want. So I'd execute on the options, give them straight to the council or the housing association or the charity, and they would be on, 60-month tenancies. And so I just replicated that same model. And that's what brings us to today, where most of it is hands-free, albeit a couple of the councils have certainly started to hand back the properties, and we've kept the families in there. That does mean that we're not getting quite market rent on them. We're taking a bit of a hit on some of them, and we're not able to do the rent increases and things like that. So yes, there's a financial hit, but if you think about 7 + 5 for 12 years, there has not been any financial hit necessarily at all on those properties. So now we're able to house these families, take a bit of a financial hit, but at a time when we can afford to take the hit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes complete sense.
I'm perfectly comfortable with that now.
And particularly when you're looking at it like from a portfolio, if you look at your entire portfolio, everything that you've got going on, like there's always give and take in the system, isn't it? And you're expecting that, that's the beauty of diversification as well, is that different assets perform differently in different environments, and you make hay when the sun shines, but then when winter comes, you don't worry too much about it because everything else is in play, isn't it? And you kind of spread the risk a bit. You've led us nicely into the next section. You talked about the present day, so let's go straight into the present day. So one of the themes of this series of the podcast is kind of taking a macro view, like standing back and looking at the world, looking at kind of the world economies, UK economies, the property market, and just trying to identify, if we possibly can, the kind of trends and directions. Because nobody's a genius, but if we can identify directions of travel to go down, we can make really good progress, I think. Whilst not wanting to date the podcast, an article on the BBC today, the headline is "Sharp Decline in Appetite for News in Recent Years," Reuters Institute says. So basically everybody's turning the news off, and this is because, and the main part of the article says that the news is so depressing: war in Ukraine, cost of living, mortgages going through the roof, interest rates, the internal conflict around immigration, all of that stuff putting people off. So, the people listening to this podcast, they're being bombarded, totally bombarded, and sometimes specifically manipulated with the information they've been given. Let's be absolutely clear about that. None of this isn't necessarily an accident. So, Dillon, give us your take. Where are we in the world? What on earth is going on? What are your thoughts?
So it's an interesting space we find ourselves in. I believe, let's take the super macro view to start with.
Yeah.
And that's an evolutionary view and a logical view. I believe we are, as a species, about to go into the biggest shift, the biggest evolution, the biggest transition in the way that we experience life since we went from essentially hunter-gatherers to settled communities. I genuinely believe that what we're about to experience is bigger than anything we've experienced as a species before, in the way that we are being kind of corralled into a life that will primarily exist digitally. So I see, certainly over the next 30 to 50 years, I see a transition to, or this life experience where there's a kind of a dystopia unfolding on the outside whilst we are living these digital utopian lifestyles. And that's already happening. If you look at the way that young children experience life right now, most of their life is experienced digitally, and they are living, utopian lives digitally whilst they are experiencing a dystopia internally and, in the external environment. And that will kind of spread out to more and more people as more and more people become connected. And so the super macro view is, I feel that we're there's a huge shift coming in how Homo sapiens actually experience life. And then there's a conversation about transhumanism. There's a conversation about how we experience our biology, our physiology, our neurology. So there are huge shifts coming. And I don't feel that our species will resemble anything like it does today in the next 100, 200, 300, 400 years. In fact, I was at an ashram in the foothills of Mont Blanc, like maybe 2009, 2008, 2009. I went there with my parents. And one of the kind of the gurus, the volunteers, swamis there, I remember I was helping him tarmac the roof during our stay. And he was talking to me about the 1,000-year life plan, the 1,000-year life view. What are you doing today that will have an impact on the species in 1,000 years? And it's always kind of given me that really long view. So I think there's a huge transition. I think closer to home, let's take property as just one example. I feel that with the environmental regulations coming in, I feel with the kind of the tax laws that will kind of only serve to hit landlords even harder. I feel that with the rise in interest rates that will push a lot of highly leveraged landlords out of the market. I feel that there are a few areas that are still open to landlords to, serve populations and make good bank, essentially. And one of those is social housing. And the second one I feel is kind of the build to let market. And I feel that the build to let market does two things. Number one, it serves lots of people at scale, at the kind of rent that they need to be served at, low rents for smallish self-contained units. But the other thing it does is it allows us to build to today's environmental standards. So we can build to, an EPC A, essentially, and just build in that future resilience. In 2011, I remember saying to my dad when we were doing the work on this first HMO, how has somebody that's, in tons of debt, and I wasn't quite at peak debt in the summer of 2011, I still had a few months to go, but how can somebody in huge amounts of debt, living with his parents, with a few rooms out on rent, how can I have control over an asset that essentially is worth quite a bit more than I could ever afford right now? Like, this is nuts. And I remember saying to him, in the next few years, I can pretty much guarantee that the economic and political and regulatory environment will become such that property ownership will be back to the lords. It will be back to the lords and serfs, which is how property always was. The lords owned the property and the serfs essentially lived on the property, and managed the land, right? And then the middle classes that screwed everything up, essentially. We didn't know how to look after those people beneath us, and we revolted against the lords. So down with the middle class. I'm not joking, actually. I'm just joking. I'm just joking. But
careful what you wish for, Dillon.
Oh, mate, totally. So essentially, that's what's happening, isn't it? We're seeing, again, in the next 12, 24, 36 months, all that fucking nonsense that we've been hearing for the last 10 years from irresponsible human beings on stage, encouraging new investors to refinance their homes in order to use the deposit money for their first rental, to go out and get as much leverage as they can, to expand, scale. All that's going to come crashing down. And I feel a huge sense of kind of, I don't know, sadness, empathy, disappointment, all these emotions that I don't really want to feel. For the people that got caught up in that. For the people that right now are sitting on portfolios that are 75 to 80% leveraged, in some cases 100% leveraged because they've used investor finance for the deposit money. Like, they listened to those irresponsible dickheads on stage that were telling them to leverage and to borrow and borrow and borrow and borrow. And there were sage voices in that time, I, talk, and I'm not a sage, but I think I was a sage voice at that time, talking about, don't leverage too much. Look at what could happen in the next 10 years. Use a hedging asset. Don't put everything you've got into one deal. And that's what people were doing. A deal would come across their desk. It would be bigger than they could afford, but they'd scrape the bottom of every single barrel to put money into this deal. And the environment's changing now. the property investors, the real estate owners that will survive this next 12, 24, 36 months are the individuals that are not 75, 80, 85% leverage. They're the individuals that have got room to breathe. So even if interest rates take a massive chunk out of their monthly rent, they're going to be able to afford to service the mortgage. And you know as well as I do, in any trade, you must protect the risk of being forced to exit that trade. Whether it's an options trade, whether it's a commodities trade, whether it's a spot trade, or whether it's a real estate trade, never be forced to exit. Make sure that you've got the cash flow and the infrastructure that you can service the debt during the bad times, in inverted commas. And I just hope that there aren't as many people as I think there are that are in a situation where it could all come crashing down, because if rates go to, just this morning, you know, whatever, the thing that's on Radio 4 at like 6 in the morning, again, not to date the podcast too much, but just this morning, you know, they're talking about the potential for a 500 basis point rise next, not the next rise, but the rise after that. And certainly 2 quarter point rises, which then puts buy-to-lets and commercial mortgages into that kind of 7.5% area. That's pretty scary for a lot of people right now who maybe are paying 3.5%. I know that we've got, you know, a handful of mortgages coming to the end of their fixed rate, and we will likely be paying twice the interest. I mean, my arse is twitching, and we can afford to do that, and my backside is still twitching, thinking, oh my God, that's going to take a huge chunk out of what we're bringing in. But, you know, we've got over 50% equity. I did the numbers the other day, and I feel comfortable, and I feel comfortable with the size of portfolio because I know that I'm going to be able to ride it out. And the plan was always to scale when everybody's exiting the market. So we haven't actually bought anything new other than executed on the options that we already had. We haven't bought anything new since the last option we did was like 2014, 2015, something like that.
Well, I think these are powerful words, Dillon, and I would urge podcast listeners to kind of skip back, you know, to the last couple of minutes and re-listen to those words. There's a lot of truth in those words. And what's interesting is, you know, your sentiments around, you know, mortgages. You know, the maths is really bonkers. You know, a small change in mortgage interest rates, which we have not seen. We've seen an enormous change in base rate in relative terms to what we're used to in the last decade. And, you know, we can only deal with the current history. We've seen these changes have been very quick. They've been consistent. You know, we haven't had a cooling off period between rates. Rates. We've got more in the tank to go, and it is having a profound impact. And, you know, you're somebody who is, just on any objective standard, financially astute. And you're, you know, you describing the fact that you're feeling some nervousness about the doubling of your monthly payments. And this is someone who is financially astute, liquid, all the rest of it. Imagine you didn't see this coming. And I say that with no hint of criticism. Imagine you had no idea that this was coming, and you've bought a London home, you've done a nice extension, and then because money was effectively free, you've gone, right, let's go pretty hard because, you know, we can, you know, then, you know, there are going to be people, you know, who have done really nothing. You know, there's no criticism here, you know, but there are people who are going to find themselves in a tricky spot, you know, with a big mortgage that doubles overnight, and they're not prepared for it. And it's not, and this is not doom and gloom. This is the reality of it. This is just the truth of it. Buy-to-lets, you know, they're going to be at like 7% at some point, aren't they? And then commercial loans, I think you really underpitch that. I think, you know, depending on the margin that's on the loan, and the lender and all the other criteria, they might even be at 12% at this point. And that, you know, that, you know, sharp and take a breath time, isn't it? You know, so I'm totally with you on all of that. And let's segue now into some sort of practicalities in a way. one of the most interesting, so what really first piqued my interest when I first heard you speak, and obviously since then we've spoken at similar events and all the rest of it, so we've had that pleasure, but the thing that really caught my interest, not only was the spirituality, which was very, so refreshing and different to the rest of the room, but everybody back in the day now, half a decade more ago, was, get your credit card out, let's go, and you were the only person standing on stage who just said, just a minute, everybody just calm down just a little bit, okay? Let's just all take a breath, everybody. And you kind of gave it to the audience. You said, look, do not go home and take, your nest egg, part company with it for the first great idea that you've heard, and go all in. Don't go all in. And I'd never heard the expression nest egg. Now, I don't want to pry into the details of your personal arrangements. That's not the purpose of the podcast. I'm very clear about, I want to respect people's privacy. But give us a bit of an overview about what that concept means, and then take us maybe into, to the extent you're comfortable, like asset allocation in this environment, like what can people do now, asset allocation wise? So just expand those two concepts if you don't mind.
So, unfortunately, and I don't want to be doom and gloom, but I think we have to have a real pragmatic discussion that's rooted in reality. There's nothing we can do now if we haven't prepared for it over the last 10 years. But what we can do is start looking forward at the next 10 years and think, right, okay, like, where do I need to be? Because there's no quick solution. There's no quick fix. There's nothing you can do to the nature of real estate, the nature of finance, the nature of compounding, the nature of growth is such that unless you're going to win the lottery, there's actually nothing that can quickly fix a situation. And so what we're experiencing today is the product of having planned over the since 2011, since I met Priya. That was the point at which I began to realize, hey, if I want to build a life with this human being, I need to get my kind of shit sorted out. So there was a sense that I was starting late.
Okay.
That led to the sense that I need to keep things really simple. And that led to a very, very kind of basic approach to asset allocation.
Okay.
And essentially that is nest egg. And I'll explain each of these, and I'll talk through the percentages and so on and so forth. I'll get into as much detail as I can.
Okay.
So nest egg,
yeah,
hedging assets, and then growth assets. Now I have a fourth asset class in my kind of portfolio, which is crypto assets.
Okay.
So let's start with the numbers. 60. So these are percentages of net worth. 60% is my nest egg. 25% in the hedging pot. Okay. And then in the growth pot, it used to be 10%. Yeah. But now it's 5%. With 5% allocation to crypto. And then if we talk about the strategies, let's start with crypto because that's the easiest. 5% of my net worth is allocated to Bitcoin and Bitcoin only. And that is just buy and hold. It will either go to $1 million a coin or it will go to nothing. But it's 5% of my net worth. And so it doesn't really matter. I mean, it matters immensely if it gets to $1 million a coin, because that's like happy days. That is like the lottery win. And of course, come on, universe. Yeah. But if it goes to nothing, and if the regulatory environment changes, and if they bring out, central bank digital currencies that then make Bitcoin redundant and all of these other things, and they manipulate the market, none of that matters to me. Because it's buy and hold. Let's see how it goes over the next 10, 15, 20 years. Next, the growth assets. Growth assets are things like my education business. They are things like my wife's businesses. They are things like kind of the new tech company that we're setting up. They are the things where, you put £1 in and potentially you could get £2, £3, £4 out on a short cycle. On a short cycle. That money then is allocated to hedging assets and the nest egg. So if you think about where the money is made in the growth pot, but that only, up till now, has only represented 10% of my net worth, and now even less, at 5% of my net worth. Whereas what people do that maybe don't understand asset allocation, and again, no judgment here, this is, people just haven't been exposed to this material. People aren't sharing this with others. So obviously, the natural response to being in a state of financial chaos is to try and grow everything you have as quickly as you can. I heard the guy speak on stage called Keith Cunningham, and he is the rich dad in Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad Poor Dad. So Robert Kiyosaki asked Keith essentially to be the avatar of the rich dad, and I don't quite know what their relationship was, but that's the marketing story that Keith got caught on. And he talked about asset allocation, and he talked about kind of this model, but in a different way. So I've kind of manipulated it, molded it to my needs. But one of the things he said was that the nest egg you need to look after. I think the only thing he called it a nest egg, but it's this thing that you need to look after. So don't put everything in your growth pot. A small amount of your net worth creates the biggest amount of your growth. And rather than keeping on kind of just plowing everything back into the growth pot, into the high risk pot, into the pot that can fall to nothing during a pandemic, during economic downturn, during a change in regulation, whatever it might be, a change in life circumstances, a change in health, whatever, rather than putting everything in that pot, a small percentage of your net worth in a pot that grows bigger than the other pots. And that money is then tucked away into hedging assets and into the nest egg. So that's the growth strategy. Essentially business. Put £1 in, get £4 out. Then the hedging and the nest egg, they kind of work together. Think about the hedging assets as a protection of your nest egg. The only reason they are there is to create a buffer between a shitty economy, which is going to destroy your growth assets, your nest egg. That's the only reason the hedge is there. So a hedge has an inverse relationship to the economy that the growth assets have. And this is where you and I have been talking about this for 10 years now. This is where people so many people were not prepared to take money out of their growth pots and put it into an asset class that, number one, showed no growth. Because when the economy is growing, hedging assets generally don't do anything, and gave no income. And people just weren't prepared to do that. But the people that did experienced the reality of what we're talking about. They experienced those hedging assets going up in value when the pandemic hit. And when markets tumbled, hedging assets went through the roof. So you were able to liquidate some of those and shore up two things: shore up your nest egg, but also shore up your cash flowing assets, or buy out of the cash flowing assets. So as an example, a chain of dry cleaners. So we've got leases on buildings, we've got leases on equipment, we've got staff to pay. But in and amongst all those negotiations for equipment and building leases, I'm always sure of having a cost of exit. If I need to exit at any time, this is what it's going to cost me. So I know I'm not just going to post the keys through the letterbox and leave the landlord to deal with my mess. So at that point, some of the hedging assets can be liquidated, not all 25%. I allocate kind of 15% to keep forever, and 10% as a kind of like a liquidity fund when I need it. That's why the 25%. I'm just going to open the door for my cat who's boiling in the heat. Oh my darling. Yeah, baby. Oh, you've got a hot body. So I allocate 10% to creating the liquidity when I need it. So you create that liquidity by selling the exiting out of the hedging assets, not being forced to exit out of your nest egg. pay down the leases, you pay off the staff, you pay down the equipment leases, whatever it is to exit, and those businesses can be shut down without any real kind of adverse impact anywhere along the supply chain. So you've not screwed anyone over, you've not screwed yourself over. And then, of course, what that leaves you in a position to do is, you know, when people are exiting, let's call it real estate, because that's my nest egg is mainly land. Well, it is just land, real estate, and a bit of forestry. The forestry I don't see as an asset. I just see that as stopping other people building on it, basically. So land, real estate, and forestry. Anyway, that's a different story. So the idea now is that I can go to the lenders now, and not only do we have a substantial kind of equity, but we have cash available. We have some cash flow. Of course, you know, when we kind of start refinancing, it's not going to be as good as it was, and so on and so forth. But that's, everybody's in that place. But when the banks can't lend to anybody on affordability criteria, and nobody actually is taking on, I mean, they are, but relatively less people aren't taking on the debt. Banks can only make money through debt. And so they're looking for, you know, good borrowers, borrowers that they can rely on. And we will be that borrower. In fact, we already are that borrower. And so nest egg, which is the thing that you're building for the future, probably not even building it for you, you're building it for future generations. Hedging assets to protect the nest egg and to give you a source of liquidity when the market turns. Growth assets, which is £1 and take out 4. And then, you know, crypto assets, for me, that's just buy and hold. I'm not interested in trading. Now, the reason to keep it simple is because, number one, I'm quite a simple-minded human being. Number two, I don't actually like finance. I don't like the markets. I'm not interested in what the FTSE is doing anymore. I've just had years of reds and greens and ups and downs and pips and points and options. Oh God, get me out of that world. I just don't like it. It stresses me out now. I just don't like it. So I don't want to keep abreast of financial news, or they're just not interested. And so when the proverbial hits the fan, I don't then want to have to decide, and this was the decision I made back in kind of 2012, 2013, when I started getting some cash flow to do all this stuff. I didn't then just want to sit and think, well, when the shit hits the fan, I don't want to decide which stocks to exit and which stocks not to exit, and what do I do and how do I know? And I don't want that. I want to know, I'm going to liquidate 10% of my hedging asset. I'm going to shore up my nest egg. I'm going to either exit out or scale the growth assets, depending on what the economy is doing. And I had no idea about crypto in those days, so that wasn't even a thing. But the reason to keep it simple is so that when you need to make fast decisions, the cognitive load does not overwhelm you. And it's cognitive load that I feel gets, you know, forces people into making some really bad financial decisions. Cognitive load and miseducation.
Let's get to cognitive load, because it's something I've heard you speak about, and that's where we're going next. I'm very, very interested in it. Now, there's a couple of points. So we're going to move into the final part of the podcast in a moment, where we're going to talk about like the current day and what we're talking about. But there's a couple of absolute gems in there. Again, there's so much value, Dillon, in what you're saying that I would really, really urge people to kind of make sure they've digested these key points. I suppose the Bitcoin purists will be flinching every time you say crypto, but I'm going to leave that to one side. It's worth having a little footnote on forestry, though, isn't it? Like, forestry is actually one of the best performing assets in the world, fairly consistently. And it has these really unique features. None of this is tax advice, you'll naturally sort out for yourself, but it has some really unique features around taxation as well, in particular inheritance tax. So it is of no surprise that the landed gentry have passed on their wealth through forestry. That's all I'm going to say to you. So go and do your own research, and you don't necessarily go and have to go and buy your own forest, although I do think that is a nice thing to do. There are other vehicles that are available as well if you're willing to do the research and manage the risk and all the rest of it. Dillon, take us up to the present day. And the prompt I'm going to use for this is something that when I heard you say it, I wrote it down, and I feel like I gazed upon it for about a week. So it was focus equals peace, peace equals purpose, purpose equals flow, flow equals prosperity. So I'm going to leave that there as our prompt. But tell us now what you're currently focused on. You know, what's keeping you busy?
So I feel, as trite and as cliche as it sounds, I feel really blessed to be playing at the intersection of these kind of three areas: spirituality, neurology, and technology, which I find great enjoyment in. A bit of a backdrop to this: I heard a lady called Jill Fielding speak. Many people in the property world will have come across her in one way or another. She actually spoke at the property event that I was volunteering at. And personalities aside and so on and so forth, this is not a comment on how good I think she is or anything like that. So this is not about how good I think her education is or none of that. I can't really have a view on that. But she said one thing: get the money sorted so you can do what you really want to do. And I guess that just sat on my heart for a while. But I always thought that, well, doing what I really want to do and making money shouldn't be mutually exclusive. And so I kind of believed it, didn't believe it, but it was there. It only really came back to me when I was on a mentorship program through lockdown. And it was a year-long program. And one of the conversations in that mentorship program was like, what do you do for fun? What do you do in your downtime? What do you enjoy doing? And I'm like literally fuck all. I can't. Yes, I paddleboard and I love swimming and I like all this stuff I love doing, but actually in my spare time up until this point at 2020, everything was around the business, everything was around creating more content, everything was, and whilst I enjoy that, actually it wasn't really, I didn't feel I was living to my purpose. Does that make sense? Like everything I did had some purpose and had some meaning, but it wasn't my purpose. And only then I started thinking, I can't answer this question. Everybody's answering this question. I can't answer it. I don't do anything for fun. I don't do anything for just pure, simple enjoyment. And that led me down a route. And it was a really interesting time because around about June, July 2020, I started getting calls from our trading house, our brokerage, saying, come back, come and do some training for us. We'll get you the students, we'll do a 50-50 affiliate deal on the training fees, and we'll give you £1,500 commission per head that opens a trading account. And so you could imagine how much money they were expecting these people to lose, essentially. At the same time, we've taken on a huge restoration project, et cetera, on a listed building. And at the same time, I'm kind of like in this dilemma about what to do, where to go next, where's my purpose. And it would have been so easy just to start that again, make a few million quid in training fees and happy days. But I just dug in and said, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not going back to that world. And that's kind of led me down this route of saying, well, actually, what do I love? Where do I turn to? And the first place I always turn to is my spirituality. And it's my texts. And that's what I was reading through 2020 when I was kind of feeling quite stressed out about the whole thing. So I went back to the Gita, I went back to the sutras, I went back to, a lot of the conversations that the Buddha had. I went back to books like, Desmond Tutu's and Dalai Lama's The Book of Joy. And so these kind of spiritual fulfillment texts. At the same time, I started kind of playing around with about 2018, 2019 technology, like brain technology. Home EEG readers that could read your brain waves, direct transcranial stimulation, which can impact your brain waves with electrical current, helmets that kind of do this thing called magnetic resonance, where they stimulate certain parts of the brain with magnets, and like some pretty like far out stuff. But it's actually, once you start to understand it, it's not far out. And so through this mentorship program, in fact, it was like 18 months after the mentorship ended, it took me a long time to answer this question. What are your kind of what things are you curious about? What things could you master? And I went through this entire process to come up with this intersection of interests. And the intersection for me was technology, spirituality, and neurology. And after that, the purpose behind that evolved into using neurology to explain what the mystics have been sharing and saying and teaching for thousands of years, and then creating, developing, deploying technology that can shortcut the process to enlightenment, whatever that means. And so taking that, I started productizing it in different ways. Started thinking about what kind of technology we could create. I went out to New York last year to talk to some investors and a whole bunch of people around, okay, this is my idea, what can we create? What's the kind of, what's funding looking like at the moment? And we were looking at creating some hardware and an app, but I was too impatient for that because that could take like $30 million in 6 years and you still might not have the thing that you want. And I haven't got time for that. I like getting things out really quickly. And so actually I went back to the world that I've been immersed in over the last 10, 12 years, which is the world of kind of, personal growth, personal development, personal expansion, but not from a business opportunity perspective, not from selling a business opportunity, but trying to package this intersection in a way that means something to the masses, in a way that is marketable, in a way that's productized, and in a way that actually can generate revenue, but now by doing something that I genuinely love doing. And so we've packaged it, even since the last time we spoke. I've experimented with a few different things, packaging it as actualization and so on and so forth. Anyway, we've packaged it now through a conversation I had with a neuropsychologist and a neurologist, essentially, and a neurobiologist. We've packaged it into a process that allows you to predictably, precisely, and purposefully turn thoughts into things. So it takes this idea of manifesting from the fluffy, spiritual, kind of unpredictable, imprecise area where you could manifest, you might not manifest, it might work for some things, it might not work for other things. And we've linked each of the 5 brain waves to specific steps in the manifesting process. The steps in the manifesting process, thought, intention, action, traction, integration. Okay. We've mapped over to those steps the brain waves that allow you to take thoughts of greatness and create a vision without being scared of, to then create solid intention using the theta wave. So thought is alpha, intention is the theta wave, action is beta, traction is the gamma wave, and then integration is delta. So we're now doing exactly what I have kind of been manifesting over this last 12 months, which is using neurology to explain what the spiritualists have been teaching for years, and then using technology to shortcut the process. So we're now playing with EEG readers. So we've just been approved, literally over the last kind of 8 weeks, we've just been approved as a third-party developer for the world's leading brand of brainwave reading headbands. So it's Muse, and many people might have heard of the Muse headband. Like nuts, absolutely nuts that we would be given the keys to their technology so we can use their headband but create our own app. I'm loving that. That's like going to Apple and saying, can you give me the source code for your iPhone, and so that I can, I just can't, the serendipity is just insane. We're also playing around with direct transcranial stimulation. We're also playing around with magnetic resonance. So doing 2 things. Number 1, helping people to understand how to gain control over their brainwaves, how to attain a level of coherence over their brainwaves, how to then kind of modulate their brainwaves using sound activation, using electrical impulses, using magnetic resonance, and then how to read their brainwaves so they can keep track, essentially in the same way as you would your heart rate variability, your respiratory rate, all the stuff that the Apple Watch tells you, we're now kind of doing in the brain space. And I just love it. I absolutely love it. And it's kind of, somebody said this is like the work of Joe Dispenza on steroids. And like, if I could be described as anything, it would be the work of Wayne Dyer and Joe Dispenza on psilocybin. Like, that's how I would like to be described. So Joe Dispenza on steroids is, we're kind of a step closer to where I'd like to be.
And what are my benefits from harnessing this technology?
Turning thoughts to things, like actually taking a thought of greatness. And I know that bit sounds really fluffy, but think about it this way. You have these thoughts, ideas of greatness, things that we want to do in the world, things that we want to do for ourselves. You know, whether that's going off to the Caribbean and setting up a surf school or whatever it might be, right? We have these thoughts of greatness. And so often that thought is kind of met by what I call a filter of fear. And three things can happen to that thought. Either a subconscious rejection of the thought, either thought comes and it's just dismissed, rejected straight away. Or it can be a conscious rejection. You rationalize your way out of that thought. So it's a thought of greatness, but you convince yourself that it's not for you, conscious rejection. Or what I call a contemplative rejection, which is where I found myself a lot, and many people find themselves, which is where you just keep thinking about the thought, and you just keep thinking about doing this thing until it's too late, or until you see somebody else has done that thing that you wanted to do, and shit, man, I had that idea like 17 years ago. So that's contemplative rejection. And so many people suffer conscious, subconscious, or contemplative rejection of a thought of greatness. Now, here's the magic. When you take that thought of greatness and you start modulating the brainwave, so you're in an alpha state, thinking about that thought and going through a very specific process that allows you to turn that thought into a robust vision, that's step one. You then turn that vision into a kind of a driving, fueling intention. And again, people fall at intention because they treat it as a very passive exercise, a spiritual, fluffy exercise. And, you know, you might say your goals out loud whilst snorting fairy dust under the full moon, and time and a place for everything, but like, that's not it. Setting intention is best done under a theta wave. And you can see all of this stuff, like when you're kind of using neuroimaging technology to see what parts of the brain are firing up when you're thinking about a future intention and shaping an intention. In the absence of control, what happens is that the amygdala fires up, which is a walnut-sized part of the brain, which is like the fear center. And you see it on neuroimaging technology. People are kind of they're building this intention and they're building their plan for the future. And at one point, fear creeps in, and you start seeing the theta wave being replaced by a high beta wave. And now they're in fear, and the amygdala is going off, and it stops talking to the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus and the hypothalamus, and all this crazy shit happens in the brain. And now you're back to square one. You're fearful of doing that thing. So, I mean, that's just the kind of the first two steps, but thought, intention, action, traction, and integration. So when you're in the right brainwave at the right time, in your goal setting or goal directed behavior, in your visioning, in your integration, you start to make these thoughts of greatness a living, breathing thing, and then you execute in exactly the way you should, and nothing will stop you. But it's not kind of an angry, overzealous, I will do this at whatever cost. It is just, you find this balance between making things happen and allowing things to happen, which is, you know, what the Yoga Sutras talks about, finding the balance between the heat and the cold, the allowing it to happen and the making it happen. And what we're doing essentially is building on the foundations that the psychologists, the spiritualists, and even the physiologists have built for us. You know, psychology, spirituality, and physiology is a great place to start. But the shortcut happens when you start taking control of your neurology, and at a greater, grander scale. You know, what is the intention here? What's the kind of the lifetime goal here? Yes, to leave the planet in a better place than you found it. But if I can have some small, tiny impact on helping people, so the ultimate benefit is moving away from the reptilian survival rooted thinking that keeps us on high alert and stops us thriving. So allowing people to move beyond that survival based thinking which we don't really need anymore as a species. We used it to get to the top of the food chain. But we're at the top of the food chain, eating everything fucking underneath us. We don't need that survival thinking anymore. Now is the time for our species to thrive and to take some control before we hand consciousness over to the robots. So starting with one brain, one human being, one individual, one Homo sapiens at a time, and helping people to escape survival thinking, but not through mindset work, not through spiritual work, actually by modulating brainwaves.
Very powerful stuff. So how would somebody like connect with this information? Like, is there a website for this? Like, how do people learn more about this?
So I would absolutely. Here's the weird thing. Every time I've done a podcast interview over the last 10 years, I've never had an answer for this.
Okay.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? But now I just want people to come and experience this. It is insane. So 2 ways to connect with me.
Yeah.
The first way is to complete the manifesting brain type assessment. So this is an assessment I created with a neurophysiologist, a neuropsychologist, and a neurobiologist. And it's 50 questions. Yeah. And it will show you where your dominance lies. Is it alpha, beta, theta, gamma, delta brainwave dominant? And you can find that at manifest.fit, www.manifest.fit. Yeah. And then the other thing I'd love for people to do, if it's all right to share, is connect with me on Facebook. So I'm only on Facebook, on my personal profile, and that's facebook.com/Dhanecha, DHAN for November, ECHA. Yeah. There is a health warning on that. My feed is probably not for the faint-hearted. I mean, it's there is some brutal and raw commentary on that feed. Commentary that I am embarrassed to learn my mum reads, but does not feel compelled to comment on.
So this is the viewer's discretion warning, isn't it?
It's definitely not fucking PG. Yeah.
I think it's fair to give that warning. You know how much I enjoy your social stuff. I mean, you have published the funniest ever social media post I've ever seen, which was, and I'm going to butcher this, Dillon, but you'll just have to forgive me, which is like the fact that I throw up into my mouth when I see you post your 7-figure blueprint to wealth doesn't mean I don't have a money mindset. It just means I think it sucks. All words to that.
You did it.
But the point you were making is that it's the insensitivity that jars you. It's it's just the complete failure to realize the lives that people are leading and how that messaging might impact them. Genuinely the funniest post I've ever read. I particularly like the fact that the whole thing of it makes me want to throw up. It makes me throw up in my mouth, and it did make me fun. So let's be really clear. You do need to approach Dillon's content as an adult. So if you are easily offended, you might well find yourself offended and do it at your own risk. Also, as we just move to a conclusion, I'm going to put these in the show notes. Dillon's earlier reference to snorting fairy dust under the full moon. Again, that's not health advice, ladies and gentlemen. That's not health advice. Whatever fairy.
Although, spending some time under the full moon, barefoot in the grass, is a beautiful thing to do.
Very good. And on that, we're gonna allow that as the final word, Dillon. So, Dillon, thank you so much for coming. It's been an absolute blast. We have, of course, gone over time, but I knew we would. I'm going to need to get you back on at some point because there's so much stuff that we haven't even touched the surface of that we could make, many more podcasts out. So, Dillon, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, brother. I love you to pieces, man.
Now then, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that's been fun. I hope you've learned a lot. It's a wide-ranging discussion. Obviously, you're always welcome to discuss any of these issues at the next Property and Investor Breakfast, whether it's online or with me in person. Obviously, follow me on social media. All of the links are below. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. And once again, thank you very much to Dillon. Take care. Look after yourself.